Now, since Proverbs 3:5 is number 6 on our top 10 most searched for Bible verses on the internet, let me ask you this question. Have you ever strayed away from God, strayed off of his path, because you rationalized what you were doing? You convinced yourself that it was the right thing to do. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about in this Thursday Bible Brief. Hi everyone, I'm Mark Leeming and welcome to the Thursday Bible Brief. If you're new here, we're in the midst of a 10-part series in which we're looking at the top 10 most searched for Bible verses on the internet. And as I just mentioned, Proverbs 3:5 is number 6. Proverbs 3:5 says this: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." Now, perhaps before explaining what Proverbs 3:5 means, I should first explain what it clearly doesn't mean. It clearly does not mean that using our brains, using our minds, somehow that doing that is wrong, that it's unspiritual. And yet clearly that can't be what it means. Number one, it's found in the book of Proverbs, and there are hundreds of Proverbs, and we're repeatedly urged throughout it to think, to meditate upon those proverbs, what they mean. And we are to cry out for wisdom, cry out for understanding. We are to seek knowledge more than silver or gold. And secondly, who wrote Proverbs 3:5? Who wrote most of the Proverbs in the book of Proverbs? Well, it was King Solomon. And 1 Kings tells us that God had given him wisdom and understanding, not just in the areas of theology, but also in the area of the natural world. God gave him understanding and wisdom about plant life, birds, reptiles, and fish. Solomon was a very smart guy. He used his brain, he used his mind. Clearly, Proverbs 3:5, he was not implying that thinking and using your mind is wrong and that we should just believe instead. Okay, so what does Proverbs 3:5 mean then? What does it mean to trust in the Lord with all of your heart and lean not on your own understanding? Well, the answer is found in the tragic rise and fall of the very man who penned that proverb. You see, when Solomon first became king as a young man, he knew that he was in way over his head, and so he pleaded with God for wisdom. He wanted to be a just and godly king, and God granted that request and made him the smartest man in ancient Mesopotamia. And during the first part of Solomon's reign, he truly did trust in the Lord with all of his heart and did not lean on his own understanding. But then he started leaning on his own understanding. By the end of his life, he had married over 700 women, along with having 300 concubines as well. Now, what you need to understand is that's what ancient kings did back in those days, partly for status reasons, but also when they wanted to seal a treaty with each other, they would hand one of their daughters over to the other king in marriage. So Solomon, he married a lot of women. He made a lot of treaties, in spite of knowing that the Mosaic law clearly forbid Jewish kings from doing that. And they were especially forbidden from marrying some of the women from the countries that Solomon did. And so, in spite of that, Solomon, he rationalized it. He convinced himself that he was doing the right thing. He was leaning on his own understanding, with the end result that at the end of his life, these pagan queens, these pagan wives who had not converted over to the God of Israel, but rather retained their pagan worship, their pagan deities, convinced Solomon to do the same. Now, before we get all high and mighty and toss King Solomon under the bus, let's consider what's going on in our own time today. Our culture tells us, the church, that we need to ditch biblical morality. We need to get with the times. This is all outdated. And so there's this great temptation in the church today to not trust God with all of our hearts, but rather lean on our own understanding. And unfortunately, that's what many Christians are doing. Now, for those of you who have been following me in this series, you may recall that number 9 was actually Proverbs 3:6, the following verse. And really, Proverbs 3:5 and 6 are meant to be seen together. So if you haven't watched that video, the link is up above right now. And even if you have seen it, I encourage you to watch it again. It will really bring today's verse into much more light as well. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. And I hope to see you next Thursday for next Thursday's Bible Brief.